the second keynote conversations for the first induction week for incoming postgraduate research students. We have a fresh new round of research centres represented. Directors of all 3 research centres will be with us this evening, and I just want to encourage everybody to question our panellists. They're all super experienced as supervisors and have loads of tips to share, so don't hesitate to add your question into the chat. You can see how to do that on the slide here if you've not done that before. You can also raise your hand if you want to jump on the mic and camera. So we will start with brief presentations from the 3 panelists, then move to a discussion, and join us with questions at any time. So without further ado, I'm going to hand straight over. I'm going to ask all you guys, research centre directors, to introduce yourselves, because you'll do it so much more beautifully than me reading off a script. So Amy, if you don't mind stepping up, I will click onto your slide and I will yield the floor.
Hello, my name's Amy de la Haye. I'm Professor of Dress History and Curatorship at London College of Fashion. I'm a writer, I'm a curator, and I'm a teacher, and obviously supervisor, and I regard all of those as practices. Thank you. Lucy, did you want me to do my presentation or just an introduction?
Just go for it, Amy, I think.
Oh, okay. Well, with Professor Judith Clark, who is an incredible exhibition maker, we are the joint directors of the Centre for Fashion Curation. Oh, sorry, I'm trying to go too fast. We're an international research centre which foregrounds exhibition making, object analysis and archival research. And we work within an academic, inclusive environment, and most of our outputs are disseminated via practice, text-based outcomes and teachings. We work closely with students. We have a number of postgraduate students in our centre. We also run the MA in fashion curation, and every year we have at least 1 or 2, often more, students from the MA join PhDs. Here we've got this year's groups staging a display of Professor Helen Story's work in the hallway at JPS. Our work is inclusive. We stage big glamorous fashion exhibitions. We also focus on all sorts of contemporary issues and inclusive, diverse groups of people, people whose histories have been overlooked, from my own work on the Land Girls to looking at LGBTQ lives in Wear It Out in June 2018. Alison Maloney, one of our centre members, organised an incredible project which was called Cabinet Stories, which comprised 1 cabinet with 7 different exhibitions by various of us that went to 3 different venues where people couldn't access museums themselves: a mental health unit, a women's prison, and a residential home for people with dementia. And we went and did workshops in each of those. And then a lot of our students, MA and PhD students, we've got lots of evidence that they've gone on to get really successful jobs, one of whom is Tori Turk, who's got an exhibition. This is an old exhibition, but she's also got an exhibition about skate culture at Somerset House. These are our contact details. You'll be able to go back and look at them.
Perfect. Amy, that was brilliant. I know I was telling you off for using more than 1 slide, but you were then very beautifully succinct, so thank you. I'm going to jump us on to our next slide. And Kate, do you mind taking the mic and camera and picking up with an introduction to the research centre you represent?
Thank you, Lucy. Yeah, I'm here presenting the Centre for Circular Design, which I co-founded with Professor Rebecca Early in 2017. But actually, we've been working together an awful lot longer than that. And the roots of the centre originally started in a research group called TED, Textiles Environment Design, which was set up back in 1996. We're really focused on practice research that addresses our move away from linear models of making and consumption towards more circular and connected ones. And really the belief that as this happens, our relationship with materials must also change. how we understand and design products not as static objects but as dynamic and evolving systems is really key to a more sustainable future, in our opinion. And I guess this approach is core to the practice of circular design. At its most straightforward, we identify material waste streams and reinvent them as new products. But this is also coupled with a more proactive approach, sort of bringing end-of-life considerations into the very start of the design process, designing the end at the beginning. Our research is often focused on very specific challenges, not least through our ever-evolving group of talented PhD students. Catherine Hall is redesigning the mechanical recycling process and blending fibres for maximum future value. Lula Mercedes is working with agricultural waste from the coffee industry in Colombia. Letitia Forst has defined design for disassembly, specifically for textiles for the first time. And Sani Visser is exploring the potential of hair as a viable waste stream for new protein-based fibres. So really broad spectrum of research interests, all with practice at the very core, be that tools for collaboration or systems thinking and mapping, or really embedding ourselves as designers in the lab or in industry to create these provocations. So I think that's probably enough for now, and I really look forward to the questions later on.
Super, thank you, Kate. Lorraine, please join us on camera and microphone.
Can you see me?
Yes, grand.
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for inviting me. So I should start by saying the Design Against Crime Research Centre started primarily when I was teaching in graphic and industrial design, and I just got fed up with the fact that you know, design culture rooted in consumerism, privilege, or worse, risk and opposition, couldn't address the social issues that I'd grown up with, particularly crime issues. And so in 1999, I was lucky enough to be able to put forward a proposal for a research initiative that became the centre. And the Design Against Crime Research Centre has been going since then for over 20 years and has three foci. So the first is on crime and justice, obviously, and particularly social justice informs a lot of our approaches. But actually, crime problems are often not the real problems. And so we have other strands. We look at public space and public collaboration. And to speak of the projects you may be able to see on the screen, on the slide that I put forward, you know, we run diverse projects, but generally, particularly at the beginning, we were looking at how to use frameworks to make sure that legitimate users had benefits and those that were abusing systems didn't. We started with crimes that affected our students, bike and bag theft, although we've looked at many crimes. And basically, we take a very basic user-centered model, and we also look at abuse and misuse. And it sounds very unlikely, but that process has enabled us to work for the last 20 years with many diverse partnerships, from government to public institutions to businesses to social enterprises and local community organisations. And so often our PhD students are those that have seen some of these projects or even been involved with them and wanted to follow more. So my own focus, there's not many staff in the centre. We sound a lot bigger than we are. There's Professor Thorpe, who runs work with government and policy and public collaboration. Marcus Wilcox, who looks at public space, and my emphasis is on crime and justice. And I'm particularly interested in involving those people who are seen as the problem, like prisoners, in designing against crime and helping us find solutions. And I've been blessed with a really diverse range of PhD students, and I suppose what we share, what the main thing the centre can put forward, I think, which may be useful to you, is the open innovation approach. And it's not rocket science, it's being very open rather than secretive, working with people at all the stages, not holding back, and collaborating, using co-design and participatory design to do that. And I think all of my PhD students are basically collaborative designers. And what we share as a team, I suppose, of different academics is an interest in figuring out how to involve more people in using co-design techniques to not just design against crime, but to deal with problems and have much more community voices and community representation in the process. And I can talk more about that, but I think I should stop because I know that you have other questions planned. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, all of you. I have to say it's such a pleasure to be on a panel with you all. I'm going to, just because you're so inspirational, all of you, in what you do and what you offer your students, I'm going to ask you to all take camera, panelists, if you will, so that people can see you when they're addressing you, and they can see you when we're chatting amongst ourselves. So I know I asked this question to the members of the research centres yesterday that we spoke to, and I asked, what do you always tell your students on your first meeting, your doctoral students on that first meeting? And everybody turned it around into what do you ask them rather than what you tell them. And then I just want to add that Ramia Maze this morning said that her top tip for setting out was getting a dog. And Toshio, when he addressed everybody tomorrow, his top tip will be to eat healthily. So I want to expand the question, not just what you tell your research students at the beginning, but maybe what you ask them, or what's your top tip for setting out? All of you, please, panelists.
Shall I kick off?
Please.
If you can hear me. I suppose one of the first things that we always talk about, which actually I must admit is a tip I picked up from Carol Calais with working with her on the MA Material Futures, is to really try and understand sort of where a student wants to end up by understanding what brought them to this point. So we quite often do a bit of an exploration, I suppose, in terms of, you know, what brought them to the point of doing a PhD and what do they want to get out of it. So for some it might be you know, a project that's been developing or on the back burner while they're working in industry and they want to redirect their career. For others it might be a very straight continuation of their MA project and they've just carried straight through. But what quite often happens is that in the excitement of sort of starting your PhD and doing all the research that you know, reviewing all the research that you see around you, you somehow become something other than what you started. So we quite often have students, for example, who collaborate with scientists or do some really interesting research into new scientific advancements, and at a certain point we have to sort of remind them that they're a designer in this equation and what are they bringing to the story. And that's happened so many times now. I feel it's something that we do a bit earlier on in the process.
Helpful.
Others, but
Oh, Amy, you're unmuted. Flip your mic.
I mean, I think in the first meeting you just establish the basics always, like how you're going to communicate. But I think the one piece of advice I always give a student is that nothing will go wrong as long as they don't go underground. So if at any point they feel anxious, worried about things in their personal life, about the PhD, as long as they don't go underground, we can resolve it.
Keep talking.
it's really good.
Keep practicing. Keep talking.
Okay, I should join that. I agree with both approaches. I'm often, when I first meet people, you know, I try and figure out what their mission is. And I'm 64 and it's taken me all my life to figure out what my mission is. And so I think it's to take design education into prison. But, you know, sometimes the PhD, the question's not the question really. And when you get to know people, you gradually get to see what the mission is and help them see what their mission is. But I have this, you know, approach which is much more about not owning all the work, like sharing the work and sharing the questions. So the first thing I say to students is, who else is interested in this? who else is interested in your thesis and your question. And there's a form, I hope David said he'd load it for me, that I can share with you. But we use it a lot with research staff too, where we sort of map out all the potential partners and stakeholders who might have something to say about the project. And I often get my students, my PhD students, to be very aware, because what happens when you've got a really good idea or you're passionate, you want to hold on to it. And the job is, if you open up, you can learn so much from other people, but you have to be sure about your own mission. And I like what Kate said about the scientists, because you are designers or design researchers or artists, and you need to make sure that you know what your role is. So this form, you know, one of the famous forms, but it's really quite helpful because you have to say quickly what you want to do. And for me, that process, I often don't just give people a form. I try and talk them through it and help them do it. But you know, for those of you who are listening and are interested in that, I think knowing who else might be interested in your work and might be able to contribute it makes you very clear about where you want to look. So as step one, I think stakeholder mapping is an agenda mapping is absolutely crucial to a PhD. So that would be my first advice.
That's brilliant advice for me too. Thank you.
You know what, sometimes we say we don't have a process for it, Lorraine. And I'd love to look at yours in more depth. But sometimes we say to them, imagine you could get all of the people who are either interested in your work or have similarities or crossovers with your work in one place. You know, we try that works. And it's another design sort of trait that quite often, coming from BA or MA, it's all about being innovative, being the first person who's ever done something. And with PhD, really, it's about who you're building from or disagreeing with or moving on sort of from, rather than isolated brilliance, you know. And it's really important.
I think that's really it. But I think that what happens in the process of starting to, like, literally, like, you know, map out who else, you know, like people say the V&A, or they'll say the British Museum, or, you know, but going really into it, it might identify some people that you could approach or talk to. And for me, it's all about talking to people and finding out how they do it and figuring out, like, what's different about what I might want to do or my students might want to do. And so I think that literal process, which is not, I'm not a very logical person, I realise that about myself. And so actually trying to make myself go through it in a logical way is helpful, because it doesn't come naturally to me. And I think being able to say in 2 sentences what the project is miraculous, because it's never easy to do that.
Oh, you know, Lorraine, I would say the one thing that I do always do, which is similar to that, is with my MA and my PhD students, I always say you've got to identify 2 things. One is what your subject is, and that subject might be really tiny. It doesn't have to be huge. So you have to identify your subject. You then have to identify who else is engaged with it. And then the PhD is what your unique intervention into that subject is. And again, it might only be tiny, but it's just marking your sort of hole in the field of your community. So you just know where your distinctive intervention might be. And also sometimes I think also to say to all the new students is that you don't always know that, and quite often it might change as you undertake more research, because it's a bit like us being asked to write a book proposal before we've written the book. You know, you go on a journey.
Absolutely, that's absolutely. I agree with both of you. It's an iterative process, isn't it? You get more clear as it goes on. But at the beginning, if you can try and find these 2 sentences to hold on to, and then a few stakeholders who are, you know, it helps you make sure that your original contribution to knowledge is actually real, because the disappointing thing is when you found someone's done it already.
Being distracted by trying to screenshot your spreadsheet, Lorraine, so that everyone can dive in.
Maybe send it around later. It's just
yeah, I'll certainly do that. I'll certainly do that.
It wasn't invented by me. There were about 4 women, like Janet McDonnell. You know, we all put our stuff together, and we were trying to come up with a way to help early career researchers write their grant forms. And we worked out between us that you could even use it with your PhD students. Why wouldn't you? It's the same process. And
Yep.
so there was four women involved in it, and it works for some people, not for others. As I said, I'm not the most logical, so it's quite helpful for me actually to just check it out.
I just love that you say you're not logical and yet you produced a spreadsheet in collaboration with colleagues. That absolutely explains.
But my thought processes doesn't always go. They're very, you know, I always sound quite dull, but I'm actually quite imaginative. So when I work with Adam, he's much more able to ask me questions that I should have asked myself. And I think that's what happens to all of us when we do research, that it's sort of like you go on this journey, and some of the alleys and roads we take maybe are not always the most obvious ones.
But you've all also identified working very closely with colleagues, sharing the founding of research centres, sharing the directorship, working very closely with colleagues that bring complementary characteristics. And this is something I've been urging everybody that I've just met this week who's starting out, is to find their allies, find those peers that are going to be their critical friends throughout that journey.
Because also doing a PhD can be a lonely endeavour. You know, you don't have a studio, you don't have a room, you don't have a clear group. And so, yeah, I just think taking part in the research events when you can, going to social events, and then even just finding people that sometimes you might just go to the British Library together, you do your own thing, but you meet and have lunch. Because I just think it's very easy to fall down a hole when you're on your own all day, every day, completely obsessed with your own thoughts and your own project. So I think, yeah, keeping a sort of social group is also really important. Just, yeah, having comrades.
Definitely.
Yeah, so this is the form, I think. So I think that being able to describe it in a couple of sentences, and then thinking about like what models or methods and theories you're going to use, what discourse is. I mean, it might be that you have 3 words on it. I'm not expecting much. This is for you, not for me. You do it for yourself. And then like trying to find the stakeholders and what the benefits might be. And when you start working through this process, which I swear to you, and I've got it on a form, but it's only a person who doesn't think it normally that has to have it on a form. You start to work out, you know, like how you might broaden or how you might narrow even by identifying these collaborators. I think the question in your wildest dream, what could be the effect of your PhD, is always sort of excited. So I took down the life story of a professional thief. And I thought when I did that, I was making a contribution to knowledge that hadn't been seen before. But actually, I learned a lot from Shirley Pitts. And I think that's why I work in prison, actually. I think it made me realise that, you know, making arts education available to people in prison has a really big connection. That certainly wasn't in my PhD, but it led me to that direction.
Have we frozen?
Yeah, I'm still here. I was just I thought maybe I should shut up. Sorry.
No. Do you know what? One other thing I just thought about when I started a PhD at UAL. I can't remember the name of the person who came to give the first talk, but they said to me, or they said to everyone, you know, remember, it's just a PhD, just get it done. And those words sort of rang in my ears for the whole, I think, 7 or 8 years that it took me to do my PhD, because I felt like it was the project of my life. You know, there was a small part of me that didn't want it to end, if I'm brutally honest with myself. And I think what I do try to instill now in PhD students is, I wouldn't put it quite as bluntly as, you know, it's just a PhD, get it done, but don't think that the end is the end of the PhD. You know, just define something that you can do within the time, because the reality is that it really is a training, and by the time you've done your PhD, you know how to do a PhD, but you never feel like you know on the journey, or maybe that was just me. But
no, I so agree with that, Kay. I think that get out of jail as quickly as you can, because it can be a prison, the PhD, and it's never finished. I'm still doing bits of mine 30 years later. I'm still on sort of aspects, because you become fascinated because of the depth of the research that you undertake. But getting out quick makes loads of sense. I wish I'd taken my own advice, though. I took 12 years.
Me too. Me too. So does my husband.
Well, I should probably declare that I don't have a PhD.
Well, that's not unusual either.
No, I think it's not unusual, and I have considered doing them at odd times, but I always thought, well, partly you can't supervise if you can only supervise students if you do a PhD which is based upon your own practice, existing practice, and I'm always more interested in what I want to do rather than going back over what I have done. But that said, I think there's a number of us who don't have PhDs, but we do have extensive experience of supervising students through to successful completion.
I think your books are fantastic, Amy, and that anyone would give you a PhD for one of them. So I get that you may not wanted to take the time out to do it, but I agree with you. You don't have to have a PhD to be able to supervise that.
No. And we ought to remember how kind of young, especially in design practice, PhDs are. I mean, we're talking about tens of years, not, it wasn't a common thing 20 years ago or 10 years ago. And so it's become much more. And I think you're right, there's no point in going back. You've got to keep moving forward.
Yeah. I think as supervisors, we're all very preoccupied with at UAL is that, we all most of us supervise practice and text-based outcomes, but one of the strengths of UAL is that we do have access to the studios and practitioners. And I think one of the challenges we've been facing, and which we've been actively supported by our students who've helped push things through, is that the PhD system doesn't always work for practitioners, because quite often they're asked to do everything that the text-based people are asked to do and their practice. So over recent years, I think we've all been developing strategies to really push the PhDs that are practice-based to make them distinctive for themselves. And I think that my students have been critical in sort of alert. I mean, they're looking for the problems in their own research, but they've also been looking at the problems in the system and saying this doesn't work. So I think also be imaginative and, don't just criticize, but if you can criticize and propose an alternative, I think we're always really receptive. So I've done things like, for instance, one of my PhD students is a costume for performance maker, and she doesn't feel happy in the sort of office environment, and she didn't want to sit and do a PowerPoint, so she performed her confirmation very generously in the CSM archive, and she made it an encounter. And if you're interested, it was Louise Chapman, and you can see it on the Centre for Fashion Curation website. We filmed the process because we started it out saying it's an experimental process. And then we reflected on, what worked and what didn't. But in some universities, simply the practice is the practice, and that counts as the PhD. So I think all the time, all of us are evolving and developing how we bring the two together. And I think that's where we work really closely with you to move PhDs as products, for want of another word, forward.
So that prompts a question I have for all of you as practitioners, and supervisors of practitioners. How do you make sure the practice doesn't get lost? That the practice is on the table as obviously for discussion as the words, the history, the theory that comes alongside? How do you enable the students?
Well, the students have to do they have to do what I've forgotten what it's called, but that registration form.
Confirmation.
Predominantly text-based, and then they do confirmation. I think I say to mine, to start with, they have to do quite a lot of writing. It's just a fact. But then I say, think about the sequence of events. You know, if you're doing the writing, how does that inform your practice? And when it comes to completion, the one thing that I really do encourage my students to do always is kind of put their money where their mouth is. If they're saying that practice and ideas, theory, whatever we want to call it, are inextricably entwined, don't give me a package of practice and a package of text. You know, actually entwine them, because that's what we're trying to do, is combine product, whatever that product is, and the product might be writing, but with the ideas. So I think be really imaginative. Don't just think that you're going to hand in a bound, you know, 2-inch thick document. Even if you're a text-based student, I think we can be more imaginative about the way we communicate the PhD-ness of our PhDs.
I do think that combination of the text and the practice is the thing that's almost most difficult, certainly for the students that we have. And I remember on my own PhD sort of being told to write about my process and feeling completely inarticulate at being able to explain my process, because it felt so, it wasn't something I ever thought about. I just did it. And I think sort of one useful thing is to write sort of little and often. So to try and write about your practice sort of as a bit more of a habit often helps, but also sometimes to take risks and allow your practice to take you somewhere that maybe doesn't seem logical or to fit in initially, because I've found that there are often times later on where it does all join up and make sense, you know, in the reflection.
Yeah, and to remember that the point is your work. Oh, sorry. I was going
to respond to that.
We all interrupt each other. Sorry.
I'm
sorry. It's probably me. But to respond to what Kate said, so for me, the visual element of research, of connecting theory to practice, is absolutely, I think, visually. So basically, when I'm looking at something, I need an example. So with the students, you know, often they're just trying to figure out like what it is they're supposed to read in order to do their practice. And so for me, it always starts with visually represent, you know, making sure that what you're describing, you can give an example of, because I need to know what people mean, what are they talking about, and seeing it for me really helps.
Yeah,
and then there are the experiments. I encourage my students to make experiments and write them up, and it's fine if they don't work. That's the other thing. They don't have to be successful experiments, but engaging and figuring out how to include the engagement in each chapter. So some of it for me is visual pictures and case studies, and some of it is experiments. And that, like, I stopped writing books really as a sort of #1 occupation in about 96, and all the work I've done since, all the research projects have all been practice led, because you know, I like to experiment. I like to try out if this would work or not. And I encourage my students to do the same. And I think for the students listening, it's sort of figuring out each bit. Where is the visual material? Where are the case studies? And where are the experiments? And when are you going to do them, sort of thing? And that's crucial.
Yeah, also, I think when things don't work, to make sure that you write that into the narrative, because like Lorraine says, the experiments that don't work, the evidence from that is every bit as valuable as the ones that seemingly do. And I think when my students, practice-based students, really struggle to articulate, putting it into words, I know with Louise, the costume person, she started doing a PhD because she discovered a group of old clothes worn by pre-Raphaelite women in the 1870s in a cupboard in her university. And so I tried to get her to make a sort of visual mind map saying, you discovered the clothes, what did you do next? And then almost draw the research journey of what you do next. And I think the sequence that you do things in is significant, and I would keep a hold of that. But don't just think sitting at the computer writing is the real work, because it's very easy to do that, especially if you're a practitioner and the practice comes more easily. You kind of feel if you're not doing writing, you're not working, but you absolutely are. And quite often you can't write until you've done your practice.
That's so important, Amy. I remember with my own project, sort of the practice almost took on a life of its own. And once I started the practice element, which was working with a new technology, sort of developing techniques for textiles, surface design techniques, I kind of went into a bit of a, you know, my own sort of headspace, and just became quite, I don't know, creative in the way I would normally work. But actually the thesis came together almost through a visual analysis of what I'd done. And then that was the point when I sort of, you know, stopped the practice, looked back on it, I could see the shape of it, and that's where the thesis began. And then I could see where there were gaps that I needed to go back and fill with practice. But it's almost like the logic, the argument emerged from the practice itself. And I think, you know, as practitioners, we use so many different techniques and methods. There's no playbook in a way. We're not, you know, I remember trying to look at methodologies and understand what methodology I'd be using, but at the end of the day it was a reflective practice, and I couldn't articulate it at the start. So I guess every
that makes loads of sense. That makes loads of sense. I even think that about ethics. I know ethics is not everybody's favourite subject, but I think, well, how am I going to work with people in prison? How is it going to be fair? And then the practice of trying to figure out how you might do that, how you might, it's not like the consent form, that's more sort of obvious, but it's more about how am I going to attract people to work with me in the prison? How am I going to advertise? What content will they be engaging with? And that really relates to the practice, and it actually makes the ethics part of it like a lot more friendly, because it's not this thing that's done to you, it's what you're going to be part of and how you might make it fair. And like, because of a lot of our work is very community based, like to be fair and to be just and to be, you know, very concerned about vulnerable people, and to, you know, to sort of iterate it a bit, figure out, well, should we do it that way, should we do it this way? Because often I'm working with a team and talking things through. It's very important, and I consider that to be practice too.
I'm going to ask Simon if he would jump on the mic to ask his question. I've made you a presenter, Simon, so you should be able to do that. It seems like a nice moment to bring some students in.
Absolutely. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, grand.
Yes. Out of the fascinating session this morning, Carlotta Allam shared a great statement about Lorraine, and in her mini Viva confirmation, so given your experience of that, which seemed to turn the usual process on its head, or allow a more punk approach, as you put it, to the confirmation, is that something that's been your experience with others? Is that something that's been taken up more broadly across the college?
We need to know more, I feel.
We need to know more.
Yeah, I think I need to know more. Amy was our confirmation examiner, so maybe she can talk a bit to it.
Any tips for confirmation would be welcome, and it comes back to this point about practice in a way. How do you put practice, how does practice feature at the confirmation? If you've got the 10,000 words, how is practice present? And I guess the punk also comes to, yeah, the system insists you do confirmation. To what extent can you work within the system to do your own, to make your own thing?
Well, if you're Lorraine, I think you just do it. If you're me, I think I tell people I'm doing it rather than ask them.
That's brilliant, Amy. Yeah, the problem is you have to articulate it ultimately, right? There's always going to be a bit of your thesis where you have to a bit of the words in your thesis where you defend what you have done and why, right? But the why is as crucial as the what, and maybe that's where there's space for something punk as well, right?
I think it's just not completely accepting everything as it is and just thinking, well, why is it like this? And if it doesn't work for this particular student, don't think that the student can't do it. Think that maybe the system isn't right for this student who is very talented, and then as supervisors we need to kind of go in a circle and think, okay, what is the best way to bring out the talent in this student? So yeah, I think it's just not blindly accepting the system as a one fit solution, because frankly it isn't. And I think that's what UAL is really good at now, is that it is much more receptive to a variety of approaches and responses.
Yeah, I was just going to say.
I totally agree with that.
Sorry, Lorraine, carry on.
I was going to say, I think that, you know, when the students got 10,000 words together and they're terrified, you know, the point is to encourage the student, like your student, to respect our staff. So the people that we get in to confirm the student, you know, they're often somebody you'd like to speak to anyway. And if you can figure out how to talk about the work, but also talk about, I suppose, the bits that went wrong, the bits that worked, there's a different dialogue. And that what I see is that we're blessed at University of the Arts that we do have fantastic staff with great experience. So the confirmation tutor, it's a time to sort of get somebody who you really respect to give you their time to sort of engage. And I suppose I'm saying enjoy it, but I know how hard that is. I didn't enjoy mine very much. I was too nervous. But because I'm
also,
much...
Lorraine, do you think as well, I thought what was good was that maybe to say to the students, don't be really fixed about who you have in terms of it's got to be someone who's a subject specialist, because when you asked me to do Carlotta's, I was really pleased because I always really like the work you do and I'm interested in it. And I knew we did have a shared interest in storytelling. But, you know, I think almost everyone in this room will probably say something along those lines. So actually, to start with, I thought, oh gosh, I hope I can contribute. But then actually what was really valuable was that by coming from a very different perspective, I kind of read her work in a different way and could maybe offer some alternative strategies. So
yeah, I thought it was a fabulous discussion, and that's
it's
you
being
know, that's
open-minded and attending everything you can as a PhD student, and don't write someone off because you think, oh, they're a dress person or they're a this person, because they've only got to say one thing in a presentation or a talk or a workshop that can just send you on a journey that you don't imagine.
I found that in confirmation, I mean, confirmation is definitely the most important in a way. I always think it's a bigger challenge than the Viva, because at that point you've at least presented the answers or got something whole, but often at confirmation you're still working things out. But I've found that confirmation is a fantastic kind of forum to design the rest of your PhD. Quite often in confirmation, with the right people in the room, they can ask questions that maybe for whatever reason your supervisory team haven't asked, and it can be a really pivotal moment. So I agree, you know, enjoy is probably tough. I think you might enjoy your Viva more. But definitely be open to new perspectives, because I think actually being able to articulate it to a non-expert, subject expert, is a really useful sort of activity as well.
Yeah, I recently had a student who was terrified, and you know, I spent a lot of time with her the night before, you know, getting her through this terror, and she was amazing. And the discussion, because I think she'd worked herself up so much, the discussion was very rich. But I don't, you know, when I say enjoy, I'm not being flippant. I realise for some of you it's not easy. But if you can have that honesty, I suppose, about what you're trying to do, and you can actually speak to that rather than try and speak the theory, that often really provokes a discussion that's useful.
Yeah. Oh, Lucy, are you on mute?
Forgive me, might cut off, and now I've got poor reception.
No, I can hear you.
You can. Good. I was just going to say that I appreciate this idea that you can't second guess who's going to have the input you need at any stage. And the idea that your discipline might exhaust your, interlocutors is just one we, need to throw away. And I hope when you come to confirmation presentations, all of you, in February, you'll not just come to those presentations that you can see is definitely in your subject area. I really would urge you to come to all practice-based, if you're practice-based, if there's the word narrative or storytelling, take anything in the abstract that resonates with you, because you'll surprise yourself at what you learn from someone else's endeavor. It's not, you can't, the idea that you're such a specialist in your field, you're never going to find the perfect interlocutor. You'll surprise yourself where you find helpful feedback. I wonder if anybody can just tell us something about surprise, maybe. I think I learn from my PhD students in surprising ways. And anything that you've learned from your students, tell us anything from methodologies to contributions to knowledge. Share with us, if you will, what you might have learned.
That's a really tough one, isn't it? I mean, I think every PhD is for me as much a learning experience for the supervisors as it is for the students. I mean, I feel that anyway. And I remember being quite surprised actually at just how quickly you become an expert on a PhD, and just in terms of, because of the nature of PhD and the depth and the focus, it seems to me that you tend to be part of quite a small group of people, and you become known in that group very quickly. So it's that kind of whole, it's hard to take confidence from that when you're the PhD student yourself, but you really will know more about your topic than your supervisors quite quickly, even when it's in the same area. So I would say all of our PhDs have, yes, they've springboarded quite often off work we've already done in the centre, but very quickly they bring a level of expertise to it that's quite mind-blowing. And that's really, I find that really positive, just because it makes you realise just how much more there always is to do. You never get to the point where you think, okay, that's that done then. It's a really constant kind of process.
One of my recent students, Roxanne, who has just finished, she completed without corrections, but she designed a chat box, the chat bot for refuge, which was to help women who were at risk of coercion and violence from men to design their phones so they couldn't be coerced or couldn't be monitored. And what I learned from her was actually, I was really scared when she did some of the hackathons, and what I learned from her as a student, and her work was amazing, was that having the courage to do it often really produces the goods. And there were some things I could see, I think I was more nervous than her, and it was a really good experience to watch her go through those hackathons to create that original contribution, because you never know whether you're going to get the information, you never know if it's going to work, but just like turning up and doing it is actually, I think, really at the heart of it. And I suppose I learned from her the courage, to do that, and that I often find myself, when I'm panicking about the project, having the courage to turn up and go through it is half the battle. I don't know if that's a helpful account.
I think it's super important to recognize the courage of our students, and also the doubt, right? So to support when there's doubt and encourage the courage. And
if you're not sure what's happened and you're scared, just keep going. and that it really brought about some fantastic work that you couldn't have predicted. And so I suppose it's about sticking with it.
And staying in contact, exactly as Amy said right at the beginning. Just don't disappear, don't go underground. So whatever your doubt is, share those as well as your progress, because that's where many do it.
And I think that also be aware that the doubt never goes. You know, I think every project I ever do, you know, I get that awful sort of imposter, what's it called, imposter
syndrome.
And that's sort of like, I'm not sure I'm the right person, I'm not dead sure, I'm stuck, I don't know where to go. But actually, if it was easy, none of you would be doing a PhD. And if you think like 0.0 something of 1% of people do a PhD, but if it's worth doing it, it is a challenge, and it is often really hard. But that's work for the rest of your life. But then when you do get there, you feel amazing. And I think the only difference about being much older is that you've however much you worry, you have a greater awareness that you probably will get there. That's the only difference. But the rest stays with you. It's not unique to being a student. It's just about really caring, I think, about what you do and worrying about it.
It's helpful you brought up imposter syndrome, actually, Amy, because we discussed that this morning in the context of doing a PhD. But you're absolutely right, it doesn't go away. You just learn to recognize it when you experience it. So that's helpful. Really helpful. Questions?
It's just like that matrix that you know, first you don't know what you don't know, then you know what you don't know, then you, and I sort of feel like I'm forever now in this mode of knowing what I don't know, which is better than not knowing what I don't know. But I can't ever imagine. It's like every bit of knowledge leads to another 20 questions. So yeah, don't ever expect to get into that final quadrant. Sorry, Luke.
No, it's perfect. We've got 8 minutes, and I do think we should touch on the Viva. We've spoken about confirmation, and maybe the Viva should, as the end point of a thesis, be the end point of our discussion today. But I don't want to step on toes if people have questions. I know this is a prime moment to catch some of our stellar practitioners at the university, so don't hold back. Raise your hand if you'd rather jump on the mic, or stick your question in the chat. And meanwhile, I will ask, Viva experiences. Share with us what you've experienced in a Viva scenario, or it could have been one you sat through with your student, or one that you were an examiner for, or one that you were a chair for. What Viva tips or knowledge of that end stage is worthwhile considering now?
Choose your examiner really carefully. And don't only choose them for their knowledge, choose them because they're dignified and well-behaved and generous human beings.
That's a very good way to put it. I think, I mean, for me, I hate formal situations. They, you know, literally they give me stage fright. And I remember whenever a Viva has practice involved, and for us that's quite often, you know, it's materials, and it's really helpful if you can get everyone moving in the Viva. There's nothing better than a conversation standing around a table of materials rather than sitting across a desk, and everyone, you know, might have a different feeling about how they want their Viva to be, but I think the conversation and the questions can really it can just be a more pleasant experience.
One of the best experiences I had wasn't at UAL. I examined Nabil El Nail, who's a fashion designer at in Manchester, and they made such a big event of his exam. So from the minute I walked in the building, there were things on display. And then the Viva took place in a room in which, and I do get my students to do this, in which he had displayed his work. And apart from the fact that it made it really feel like it was an amazing event, it meant that never once did I lose sight of the fact that he was a practitioner, first and foremost. And there were certain things I could have been really picky about that I wasn't, because I kept thinking, you know, don't forget the practice. The practice is completely amazing. And so basically what he'd done was he'd mentioned a key thinker in his title, but he hadn't actually read that key thinker's work because it's really complex. He diluted what he'd sort of read, what other people had read about them. And I thought I really could go one way or the other with this. And then I thought, be generous, because actually it's a fantastic PhD. His practice is amazing. His ideas are amazing. And the really wonderful thing is that now he's the MA Women's Wear course leader at LCF.
That's amazing.
And he's my friend. He'd never have been my friend if I'd picked him up on that.
I do like, for the students who are listening, and it might seem a long way off, but I really agree with Amy. Like, when I've been in different countries examining PhDs, you know, the Swedish and the Italians do it so much better than us. You know, they really celebrate. And, like, you know, the university needs to get behind this, and how you can make sure is do it yourself. Make sure that if you're doing film, that you have it set up, that you get your tutor to make sure that's really, you know, an element of display, because it makes such a lovely experience to share the work. What I love about the Swedish experience was that people are present to listen. It's not just a private conversation. So I think figuring out how to extend what you're doing so that everyone, after it's over, everyone else can see what you've done, which might be through your practice, is really sensible. And you know, don't ask, just suggest that it's the normal way forward, and you might find the college goes with you. And that's what I mean, probably what Carlotta meant by punk, because if you keep asking permission, they always say no. So just presume that they're going to enable you, and make sure it works for you too.
Gosh, I think public defences of theses in continental Europe are terrifying. I love the idea that you have a private conversation, and then once it's over, you can make the exhibition that's public, or publish the book, or whatever it is. It depends whether you're ready.
They have the PhD printed up into book form that's circulated. I mean, although it is scary, it's a much more marked, you know, it's marked.
It's a rite of passage in a public.
You know, like in Milan, they had the exhibition in the front for the PhDs. I love that. I'd like to see more of our PhD students recognised in that way. You know, we have a show for MA students. Why not PhD students, you know? So if they're not going to give you one, then demand your own. That's what I'm saying.
You've all been incredibly generous.